Okay, so today we'll talk about shadowing, scopes, and the idea of freezing in Rust. Okay, let's say we have a variable. It's going to be of type f64, and then we set it to 3.1415, for example. Okay, now the name of this variable is pi. Okay, if we try to change it, to, let's say we say pi 3.142. okay, Rust will start warning us, and it will say cannot assign twice to immutable variable, which means we will have to make it mutable. So we have to make it mutable, and then it will allow it. Now let's print this to the terminal to see what it looks like. It's going to hold the first value or the second value. Now if you run this code, you see that pi is holding 3.14, okay, which is the last value we created, which is the last variable we created here. Okay, now what has happened to this pi? It's no longer valid. We've somehow overwritten it. Now in some cases you would like to use this pi, this value that you've already set, without creating a new variable. Okay, we want to use the same name, but for the meantime we want to use a different value. Let's say 3.14 alone. Okay, what we can do in Rust is use what is called scope. So if you open a curly brace and then close it, you are now inside a different scope. And now what will happen? The same way we did this, we also created another variable that we called pi. We set it to 3.14. And watch what will happen when we print this to the terminal. Now we are getting 3.145, which is the first value. So for some reason, this declaration no longer shadows, overrode this one. However, if you decide to print this again, you see that the first one, pi n, ran first, and then the value was 3.14. But after that, this one was 3.145, was 3.1415, which is the first value we set. So for some reason, we are able to use a variable with the same name inside this scope without overwriting what was inside here. And this is what is called shadowing in Rust. So while inside here, inside the new scope, if you have a variable you've defined, you can reuse it. You can define another variable here as long as you use the let keyword. Okay, you can define another variable with the same name and then use it to do whatever you want. But watch what will happen if I remove this let. If I remove that and then run the code, you see that the value is now 3.14, which means this declaration right here inside another scope has overwritten what we have here. So it's not actually shadowing it temporarily, it overwrote it. Okay, so in order to make this work, you have to use the let keyword. So the let keyword will overshadow this first declaration of the variable only inside the scope, and once you're outside of this scope, you can now use the previous value. So this comes in very, very handy when you want to do something very fast, okay, without declaring a new variable, or while using the same name. Let's say you have a mathematical calculation that you've already used the variable pi. You can just create a new scope, shadow the first declaration, and then do whatever you want to do very quick, and then you can exit there. In fact, you can return some value here. You can even do some calculation. Let's say you call this multiply, okay, and then you set it to whatever you return inside this scope, and then inside here you return, let's say pi times 2, and let's say pi times 10. Here we have a floating point number, which is pi, set to 3.14 here, and we are trying to multiply it by 10. Okay, and this is actually not a float, but just an integer of type i32. So you can't multiply a float by an integer. You can do this in many other languages, but in Rust you can't do that. So you just have to convert it to a floating point number, and it it will be fine. Okay, so float will multiply with float, but not an integer. Now, inside this scope, we've just created this new variable with the same name as what we have outside the scope. Did some calculations with it, even returned the value that we stored inside here, and then we can use multiply. If we print multiply to the terminal, you see that multiply will now hold the multiplied value of pi times 10, which will be 3.14 times 10. That will be at 1.40000. Okay, so this is very, very important. Okay, so let me show you. Now here is another interesting thing in Rust: freezing. Now let's go back to the scope. So we are now inside the scope, right? Let's delete this one. Okay, and let's delete this one. Now the same thing, we have the variable pi and we have this variable pi right here. Here in this scope, if you access pi, we will be reading this value, but outside that scope we'll be reading this value, right? But watch what will happen if you assign the new pi we created, overshadowing this one, and then we'll set it to the pi from here. Now watch what will happen. We can no longer use this pi. If we try to say something like pi is equal to 3.1, it's not going to allow it. So Rust has frozen this pi over here because we've assigned it to another variable in the scope that has the same name. In fact, if you hover it, it will say cannot assign twice to immutable variable. Okay, cannot assign twice to immutable variable, which simply means you can't do that. You've already shadowed this pi with the same name. So once you get here and you try to use pi, you will actually be using this one. So this one will be frozen and will only be unfrozen outside. So you can get outside here and then do something like pi is equal to 3.14, for example, and it's not gonna complain. But inside the scope you won't be able to do it, simply because this pi has been frozen and can no longer be used because there is another name that already because there's another variable that has the same name, and this makes a lot of sense because this variable has the same name as this one. So there's no way Rust will know that you are trying to use this one while they have the same name. So while inside the scope, go ahead and use this one. This one will be frozen, therefore you can't change it. You see, this one is immutable and this one is mutable. Okay, unless you take this one out, then you can now assign this directly. If not, Rust will freeze this one and allow you to use this one, and then outside that scope right here, you can now go ahead and continue to reuse your mutable reference. Okay, so in this video we took a look at three things. First, scopes. Okay, you can just open a curly braces. So while inside, once you have open and closing curly braces, you are now inside another scope. You are now free to create variables with the same name that you have here, okay, and shadow it temporarily, and then reuse it to do whatever you want. And then at the end of the day, once this scope has ended, you can now continue to use the previous definition. Okay, then we also talked about shadowing. Okay, when you create the same name, when you create a variable that has the same name outside a scope, you will shadow that variable. Okay, like what we did here. As long as you are still inside the scope, and then by the end of that scope, you will now continue to use the initial references. Then we talked about freezing in Rust. If you create a variable with the same name and then inside another scope you create another variable with that same name, okay, and then assign this variable to it. Then Rust will freeze this one so that you can no longer use it. So you can now only use this one. So this is very important.